These are portraits of a vast, rugged, treacherous continent. They portray ships and men, machines and ice. A composite portrait of a continent which has challenged man since first he could sail beyond the limits of his horizon. Antarctica.
A brilliant and erratic hydrographer named Alexander Dalrymple was nominated by the Royal Society to command the Transit of Venus expedition to Tahiti in 1769. Captain James Cook would head the expedition. In 1772, James Cook would command the Resolution, while another ship, the Adventure, would follow. These two ships would be the first time in history that anyone crossed the Antarctic Circle, as far as we know. They would eventually reach the 60th parallel after running into ice multiple times. Cook would later convince himself that if land lay further south, it was practically inaccessible. In 1819, while rounding Cape Horn, skipper William Smith of an English merchant ship, the Williams, was driven south by adverse winds and discovered what became known as the South Shetland Islands. When the Royal Navy got news of this, they decided to send another ship back down there. Williams would remain on the ship as the pilot, but the commander would be Edward Bransfield. On January 30th, 1820, he would sight the Trinity Peninsula, this being a northernmost part of Antarctica. Bransfield made note of two high mountains covered in snow, one later being named after him. Much of what Bransfield saw has been lost due to mishandling of his log. Bransfield was a relentless explorer, and he would follow the ice sheet claiming much land for the British Crown. However, Russian Fabian B would be funded by Emperor Alexander I on an expedition to the South Polar region in 1819. He was basically supposed to find land near the South Pole. Two ships, the Vostok and the Mirny, would head out on June 4th, 1819. On September 5th of the same year, the expedition would cross the Antarctic Circle, the first to do so since Cook. It should be noted around the same time, seal murderer and explorer Nathaniel Brown Palmer also discovered Antarctica. In 1823, James Weddell, a British voyager, would have one of the first documented trips to Antarctica. This is after his already successful trips to the South Orkney Islands. Weddell would go 214 miles further south than Captain Cook. However, Weddell believed there was no land in sight. On New Year's Day in 1841, another British officer named James Clark Ross would cross the Antarctic Circle. On January 9th, they broke into an open sea. Ross had discovered the Ross Sea, and he now set his sights on the South Magnetic Pole. On January 11th, land was reportedly straight ahead. Ross first thought it to be an ice blink, which is a whiteness in the sky caused by the reflection of ice ahead, but as they approached, they realized the ice blink was actually a mountainous snow-covered land. He would see and name many mountain ranges, some ranging as high as 8,000 feet. Ross would also report odd behavior in his compass. Robert McCormick, the surgeon, would describe the discovery as a stupendous volcanic mountain in a high state of activity. His assistant and friend of Charles Darwin, Dr. Hooker, ran to grab his notebook and quickly wrote down his reaction. All the coast was one mass of dazzling beautiful peaks of snow, which when the sun approached the horizon reflected the most brilliant tints of golden yellow and scarlet, and then to see the dark cloud of smoke, tinged with flame, rising from the volcano in a perfectly unbroken column, one side black, the other giving back the colors of the sun. This was a sight so surpassing everything that can be imagined. It really caused a feeling of awe at the consideration of our own comparative insignificance and helplessness, and at the same time an indescribable feeling of the greatness of the Creator in the works of His hand. This peak would be 12,400 feet above sea level and was belching flame and smoke. Ross named it Mount Erebus after the ship, and a smaller extinct volcano to the east, Mount Terror. As the ship sailed south, Ross saw a low white line extending from its eastern extreme point, as far as the eye could discern, to the eastward. It presented an extraordinary appearance, gradually increasing in height as we got nearer to it, and proving at length to be a perpendicular cliff of ice, between 150 feet and 200 feet above the level of the sea, perfectly flat and level, and without any fissures on its even seaward face. Ross would realize there was no way to penetrate this, and would call it the Victoria Barrier. It was later changed to the Ross Ice Shelf. After continued attempts and failed missions due to the ice wall, Ross gave up his Antarctic journey. In 1873, Sir Edward Dahlmann, on behalf of the newly funded German Society of Polar Research, would go on to discover new Arctic routes on his ship, the Grunland. The Grunland would be the first steamship to travel to Antarctica. In 1887, the Royal Geographic Society instated an Antarctic Committee, which successfully encouraged many whalers to explore the southern regions of the world. This would also lay the groundwork for a future lecture by Dr. John Murray. It would be titled The Renewal of Antarctic Exploration. It was given to the Royal Geographic Society on November 27th in 1893. Murray advocated that the research into the Antarctic should be organized to resolve the outstanding geographical questions still posed in the South. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration was inaugurated by an expedition launched by the Belgian Geographical Society in 1897. The Belgian Antarctic expedition was led by Belgian Adrien de Gerlache. In 1898, they became the first men to spend the winter in Antarctica. The area they stayed in wasn't thought to be part of the Antarctic mainland. This honor would later go to the British Antarctic expedition of 1898 through 1900. This would be the first to visit the Great Ice Barrier, or the Great Ice Wall, since James Clark in 1839. This would be the first time they would document going to the barrier's surface. It was also the first time they used things like sleds and dogs as help. The zoologist Nicolai Hansen had fallen ill during the winter, and on October 14th, 1899, they would suffer their first fatality. As winter turned to spring, the party prepared for more ambitious inland journeys using the sleds and dogs. However, their base camp was cut off from the continent's interior by high mountain ranges, and journeys along the coastline were frustrated by unsafe sea ice. The expedition leader would admit that the most significant exploration achievement was the scaling of the Great Ice Barrier and the journey to the furthest south ever reached by man. In 1901, the British National Antarctic Expedition, later known as the Discovery Expedition, was a joint enterprise of the RGS and the Royal Society. The expedition would be led by Captain Robert Falcon Scott, who was a British Royal Navy officer and a wicked man. Scott would kill animals he figured were weak, and would feed them to animals he figured were stronger. He would even have the dogs resorting to cannibalism. Scott would bring along with him Edward Adrian Wilson, aka Uncle Bill, as another member of the party, as well as Ernest Shackleton. After reaching the ice, these three would travel to what they believed was the South Pole. Shackleton would get very sick and begin coughing up blood. They would have to return and wait for a later date. The group would discover the polar plateau in their journey. This is now home to what's known as Dome C, a place used for drilling. When the guys would get home, many of their readings for magnetism would be considered amateur. Discovery returned to Britain in September of 1904. Scott would be made a hero and was showered with wealth and gifts from the royal family. Scott and Shackleton would develop a somewhat rivalry due to conflicting ideas and similar routes when Shackleton would return. Ernest Shackleton would command the Nimrod expedition in 1907 to 1909. This British Antarctic expedition wanted to be the first to the South Pole. When the group got there, Mackey, David, and Mawson decided to ascend Mount Erebus, the only active volcano known in Antarctica. They would be accompanied by 3 additional members of the party. 5 of the 6 members would make it and come back. The other one would be frostbitten and have to return. On October 5th, 1908, David led Mawson and Mackey on an attempt to reach the magnetic South Pole, traveling 435 miles. And on January 16th, 1909, they supposedly arrived at the South Magnetic Pole and took possession of the region for the British Crown. The crew would return to New Zealand on March 25th, 1909. In 1910, Germany would go back to Antarctica under the control of Wilhelm Filchner. He would be one of the first to discover and document the ice walls. He would go on to find the Filchner ice shelf. Filchner's ship, the Deutschland, was a Norwegian ship built specifically for work in polar seas. The crew would depart on May 4th, 1911. The first stop was at Buenos Aires, where they loaded additional stores, coal, and 14 tons of rock ballast. The first ice they encountered was on December 15th. By early January 1912, the ship was completely surrounded by icebergs and floes. In 3 days, we spotted almost 200 bergs. On January 27th, samples of clay were brought up from 11,000 feet, providing evidence of approaching land. 3 days later, land was sighted to the southeast. An ice cliff, approximately 100 feet high, appeared in the distance, with the continent gradually rising behind it to a height of 2,000 feet. He wrote, "We had reached the cliff of the ice overlaying the Antarctic landmass, land that nobody before had seen or stepped upon, new territory. This would be the southernmost point reached by the Deutschland." The Deutschland steamed along the ice shelf for several days. The Deutschland and its crew eventually reached an ice-rimmed bay at the foot of a huge ice shelf and set up camp. A loud noise would erupt throughout the whole camp. This was due to the shifting ice. Everything was moving around them. They would reason this disaster occurred due to a spring tide, coupled with a sharp drop in barometric pressure. The Deutschland drifted for the next few days, waiting on improved weather conditions. They planned on returning home, but it was already March and the fog had set in. They were frozen in. Filchner wrote, "The devil himself has sealed our fate." The Deutschland was completely frozen in by March 6th. To break the monotony of the long winter ahead, Filchner promoted activities and duties as tents and small cabins were built on the ice and scientific equipment was installed. They would also wire the ship full with electrical lighting to keep the polar night to a minimum. As for entertainment, sporting activities were held regularly on the deck, and on the ice. They would even include horseback riding. Filchner himself could not partake in most of the physical activities, as he gained some bruised ribs from falling from a mast previously in the journey. By mid-June, he was feeling well enough to lead a short but dangerous journey over the ice in search of Morrell's Land, or New South Greenland. The American sealer Benjamin Morrell thought he had seen land in 1823, only 37 miles east from where Deutschland was trapped. Filchner, together with officers Kling and Koenig, left the ship on June 23rd with 2 sleds, each drawn by 8 dogs, going out for 3 weeks. Traveling was far more difficult than they had ever imagined. Daylight lasted only 2 to 3 hours each day, as the sun set around 2 p.m. The lack of light was caused by the same phenomenon that causes the Alaskan sunlight phenomenon. This is due to the Earth being a plane and it being surrounded by a giant ice barrier, while the sun's pattern moves in a circular rotation in between what we know as the North Pole and what you now know as the Great Ice Barrier. This would be one of the first clues proving the sun circles above in the middle of the land. As the temperatures plunged to negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit, Filchner would write in his diary, "At night we were shivering in competition in our flimsy tent. Simple task took hours because of the cold temperatures. The scientific instruments froze when they were removed from their containers. All the instruments had to be thawed before use." He described it, "To take a sighting, we needed 2 hours rather than the usual 10 minutes. They had journeyed 31 miles, but none of the land reported by Morrell in the previous journeys could be seen. They dropped a lead weight through a hole in the ice, and when it reached 5,248 feet, the line broke. It was clear to them what he had seen was a mirage. The return journey was even more dangerous than the one on the way out. Large cracks had opened up in the ice, which meant they had to take a bunch of detours, as well as some areas being frozen over with extra thin ice. The ship wouldn't return until December 19th, 1912, and would dock into South Georgia. Between the wars, the Germans made a further voyage in 1925 with a specially designed ship for the polar regions. This would be called the Meteor, and it would be under the command of Dr. Albert Mers. In 1928, Richard Byrd began his first expedition to Antarctica, involving 2 ships and 3 airplanes. Byrd was a Navy officer who made his claim to fame through historic expeditions. During this trip, a base camp named Little America was constructed on the Ross Ice Shelf, and scientific expeditions by snowshoe, dog sled, snowmobile, and airplane began. Photographic expeditions and geological surveys were undertaken for the duration of the summer, and constant radio communications were maintained with the outside world. After their first winter, their expeditions were resumed. Richard Byrd would supposedly fly over the South Pole and return.
Now they're alone. See Byrd studying the sun compass, charting his course to keep from wandering like a lost eagle over that featureless expanse of ice. They measure 50 feet from ridge to ridge. The air is bumpy here. The men crawl over each other in the heavily loaded plane like bees in a hive, each at his task. Byrd navigating, Balkan piloting, McKinley surveying, and June making the motion picture record, or taking a turn at the wheel. The bristling peaks of the Green Maud Mountains rise up 10 to 15,000 feet before them, like ramparts of frozen rock barring the path. Byrd studies the range. The plane is climbing under full power. A ton of gas has been consumed. The plane now weighs 13,000 pounds, but it has to climb over 2 miles. Now they are approaching the Axel Highjump Glacier, over 10,000 feet above sea level. The plane is too low. It needs height to get through the mountain wall. The plane struggles. The controls turn loosely in Vulcan's hands. Byrd knows what that means. The grade is too steep. The overloaded wagon may begin to run back downhill. He sends orders forward to Vulcan. In that awful moment of uncertainty when their lives hang on a thread, Vulcan reads his instructions. There you see the glacier, right there facing him. Vulcan shouts we must drop 200 pounds immediately or go back. Of course, they could drop gasoline, but if they sacrifice their gas, they fail. Byrd decides overboard with food that stands between them and death in case of a forced landing.
He would have to lighten the airplane's cargo in order to get enough altitude to reach above the polar plateau.
Now here it comes. At last the news they have listened for so anxiously. It comes in those same dots and dashes. Oh boy, the news!
It would take 18 hours and 41 minutes. But Byrd would supposedly make it to the South Pole.
Byrd's careful observations bring them back over the Highjump Glacier, the honeycombed, wind-worn pass out of that wilderness of barren desolation. They are sliding down to the depot where the thirsty motors can be refreshed. Little America waits anxiously while the plane is landed and refueled. The last danger has been cleared. They are in the air again, returning over the furrows and crevasses on their last lap home. The wind is on their tail and they are making over 100 miles an hour. How close would they hit it? Now in the distance he spies the object of his search. It is the towers of Little America, which they left 18 hours ago. They have flown 1,600 miles over a waste, emptier and more deadly than any ocean.
The expedition would return to North America on June 18th, 1930. Byrd would again journey to the ice ring in 1934. This would be the first time they would have automotive transportation as a valuable asset. Results from the first seismic investigations in Antarctica provided the initial evidence of the extent to which the Ross ice shelf was afloat. The first human voices were transmitted by Little America on February 1st, 1934. And later, a weekly broadcast was carried over the Columbia Broadcasting System in the United States. Notice Columbia uses a flat Earth map. This trip would nearly kill Byrd, who would do an isolation meteorology project. He would suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning from a poorly ventilated stove. Upon returning, Richard Byrd wrote of his travels in the book Alone. After 77 days of exploration and covering 862 miles, the crew decided to come home on December 29th. In 1938, the Germans would again go to Antarctica, specially refitting a seaplane carrier, the Schwabenland, for the purpose. Nearly a third of the entire expedition budget was spent on this alone. It would be under the command of Captain Alfred Richard. The plane could be catapulted out and craned back in. This would clearly be a military expedition, under the control of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. This crew would send out an invitation to Admiral Byrd to join them. On the mid of November 1938, he arrived in Hamburg and showed the crew and a clearly selected publicity of 84 persons his new Antarctic documentary. The Schwabenland would drop anchor in Antarctica on January 20th, 1939. The two Schwabenland aircraft flew several missions across 600 square kilometers of Antarctica, taking more than 11,000 pictures with their specially designed cameras. New canning technology was invented for food needed on the voyage from back to Germany. The inspiration for the expedition may have had hidden occult motives as well. Some believe in the Nordic Atlantis, hidden beneath the polar ice, which sprang the Germanic race. The Nazis would drop thousands of swastika flags on the region with little spikes on the end of them, claiming it for Germany. They were in Queen Maud Land, an area claimed by Denmark. They would rename the land New Schwabenland after Swabia as it's known today, which was one of the original duchies of the German kingdom. They would extensively photograph the region and report many mountain ranges exceeding 12,000 feet in altitude. Amazingly, they allegedly found ice-free ponds heated geothermally in which grew various unknown species of algae. They also discovered the southernmost tip of the fault line that runs from New Zealand through New Schwabenland and up the Atlantic Ocean, known as the famous Atlantic Trench. The Germans concluded that such features might indicate the presence of rocky caverns on the continent heated geothermally, the perfect place for a hidden base in the world's most isolated, desolate, and inaccessible wilderness. This would be ideal for any military institution. It was known that the German dietitians were commissioned to prepare tasty and nutritious meals using only what was available on the land. Many animals were dissected so their bodies could be tested for fat, protein, vitamin, and other nutrient content. The Germans seemed to be preparing for a semi-permanent to a permanent presence on the ice ring. Famous Nazi Heinrich Himmler became a believer in the Hindu concept of world ages. He believed that the current age would end in a global cataclysm, thereby giving birth to a new world age called the Satya Yuga. By sending a Nazi colony to Antarctica, Himmler believed that he was ensuring a remnant of the pure Aryan race would survive the coming cataclysm with its society and culture intact. It's interesting to know that Germany would build more than 24 super subs during the war, each the size of an aircraft carrier, but they weren't warships, they were simply cargo ships for underwater. They would oftentimes supply the warship submarines. Evidence suggests at the end of the war, activity to New Schwabenland continued even after Germany's surrender in 1945. The Nazis had already been experts at underground bases. In fact, they set up several factories underground. This makes the conspiracy of Nazi bases in Antarctica entirely possible. The United States Antarctic Service Expedition in 1939, often referred to as Byrd's Third Antarctic Expedition, was an expedition jointly supported by the United States Navy, State Department, Department of Interior, and the Treasury. This trip would include the impractical snow cruiser. This was mostly for the fans. They recorded several scientific experiments on this mission, making it easier for future expeditions. They would head home in February 1941. They would arrive in May. In 1943, Argentina would claim territory that would supposedly overlap with British territory, and this wouldn't sit well with the Crown. In response to this and earlier German explorations, the British Admiralty and the Colonial Office launched Operation Tiburon to establish British territorial claims against Argentine and Chilean incursion. They would also establish a permanent British presence in Antarctica. Here's George James from Cardiff speaking about Operation Tiburon.
My name is George James. I'm nearly 90, so we 90 years makes no odds. I feel a lot older sometimes even than that. But no, when I was down there, of course I was just doing my job in the Navy. As you know, I was the wireless operator aboard HMS William Scoresby, and she was an ex-whaling ship that used to be down there doing research into whales. But few schools of thought. I say the one thing was that it could stop Germans from using any of the open spaces down there for bases for their efforts in the war. But that was denied by others who said, well, ambition sort of thing. But nevertheless, it seems to be ambition that's come to fruition because there's now about 20 bases down there. So it was the start of something big. And it was officially an expedition, because I've got a memo that sort of states this fact. And so it was quite an eventful performance, really, to be there. Because wildlife was everywhere. You saw whales and you saw seals. Seals could be quite friendly, but I was once chased along a beach by a sea leopard, which is quite a different kettle of fish. They burn their mouths come open, really open, you know. The quietness, the peace of the place is something that does strike you. And everything around you, it's such an unusual scene for what we're used to then, that it becomes almost a magical place when you're there, although you know that there's a lot more behind it all than just what you can see. But I must admit that as far as conditions are concerned, the one difficulty was that the conditions changed very rapidly. You could be in nice sunshine, nice weather 1 minute, and 10 minutes later you're trying to ride out a gale, you know. This is the sort of thing that used to happen, and that gets very difficult to handle sometimes. But of course that was the captain's job, not mine, and he was a lovely man, our captain, and he was also a hydrographer, more than just a navigator. You knew you were in safe hands when you had somebody like that there, and you just got confidence in it all in the end. We sort of amused ourselves to an extent, but when you're at sea, people used to, some were reading, some were writing, they all had some little thing going on. But we had quite a few evenings where they'd be telling jokes, you know, different things that used to crop. To do monologues, one of them used to do, and that sort of thing. And because we had these old gramophones that we managed to keep going, so we could have a bit of music there. But I must admit that on the Scoresby, because of the construction of the ship, it was pretty hard going. Particularly if you were up in the bow, she was nearly turning over sometimes. I was lucky in that I was down more aft where my wireless office was, and conditions were a little more comfortable, but simply because I had the radio equipment in there with me. It's something that you just got to, it's so different to what you've ever been used to that you've just got to get, it gradually absorbs you, gradually absorb it, and it becomes part of you, you know, that you take no notice in the end, you know what I mean, it's become everyday sort of thing. And but it's a wonderful experience.
The expedition was led by Lieutenant James Marr. Operation Tiburon provoked Chile to organize the first Chilean Antarctic expedition in 1947 through 48. Also kicking off in 1947 would be Operation Highjump. This complex mission would involve 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. The official objectives given by the U.S. Navy would be 1. Train personnel and test equipment for frigid conditions. 2. Consolidating and extending the U.S. sovereignty over the largest area of the continent. This portion would be publicly denied. They would also try to establish the feasibility of a permanent residence. 4. They would develop techniques for establishing, maintaining, and utilizing air bases. 5. Would be to amplify existing stores of knowledge in electromagnetic, geological, geographic, hydrographic, and meteorology within the area. 6 would be to supplement objectives of the Nanook expedition.
Sums up to this, gentlemen. The Secretary has approved our plans, confirming you, Admiral Byrd, as the officer in charge of the expedition, and you, Admiral Cruzen, as the task force commander. And we get what we need. That makes Operation Highjump the greatest polar expedition in history.
Never before has anyone attempted to take a fleet of thin-skinned steel ships through 300 miles or more of crushing ice pack.
The fleet must cover 12,000 miles to reach Antarctica. At the 100th meridian west, the groups are to separate, and the central group proceed to a rendezvous point at Scott Island.
Ships of the western group will proceed 10,000 miles south to the Balleny Islands, 860 miles to the west of Little America.
Aboard the Mount Olympus, now heading south in the Pacific, Admiral Cruzen gives a traditional command, and up goes a strange flag. The Jolly Roger, signifying the crossing of the equator and authorizing the ancient shenanigans of the sea, whereby all landlubbers are painfully presented at King Neptune's court. The veteran shellbacks copperplate the polywogs' interiors with a mixture of cylinder oil and chewing tobacco. Next, the polywogs must kiss the bosun's, the only kiss they'll have for many a long month. They wind up with a dunking and a final whacking to warm them up, officers and men alike. Wearing the whiskers of Neptunus caninus, Ricky, the veteran husky, presides as the pups become doggy shellbacks. Now the serious business of the sea takes over. Danger menaces the fleet oiler, Cacapon.
Admiral Byrd will sail the carrier close to the edge of the pack ice, then fly his 6 30,000-pound land planes from her deck, 800 miles across the pack to Little America.
As the Philippine Sea sails on her 10,000-mile voyage, the advance group under Cruzen has voyaged far south. They sight their first icebergs just above the Antarctic Circle. Careful bearings are taken, for the hulls of these ships are no thicker than was the steel skin of the Titanic. All the while, engines throb, taking the central group deeper into icebound seas. 600 critical miles of their 12,000-mile voyage still to go. A little Adelie penguin comes aboard as pilot and rides the deck for 2 solid days. Admiral Cruzen orders reconnaissance by helicopter and himself boards the plane as observer. For the first time, the helicopter serves as the eyes of the fleet. At last, he sees his lead. Reconnaissance by helicopter has paid off. And just in time, for the helicopter's gas is running low. The Admiral is safely back aboard. Cruzen changes course to head the fleet toward his lead. No open roadstead here, no channel markers. The turn is difficult for the big ships. Marooned, Admiral Byrd and his staff plan the big flight to the South Pole and far beyond. This is the culmination, the last mass flight. 4 planes spanning out over a continent of unknown territory larger than Texas, California, and Arizona combined. Over freezing wastes without people, without life, without vegetation. Nature's most formidable challenge to man. The Beardmore Glacier, 200 miles long, 50 wide, 1,000 feet deep, who knows? Byrd checks position by the sun compass. The glacier signals the South Pole itself. Here, Byrd drops the flags of the United Nations, carefully boxed, a symbol of America's goodwill to all nations. Now beyond the pole, Byrd focuses his cameras and magnetic detectors on land new to him and to all mankind. Plateaus, mountain ranges with peaks 20,000 feet above sea level. These official motion pictures can give only a cross-section of the miles of photographic records accumulated on this expedition by the Navy. But international policies cannot concern the Admiral now. His duty is to keep his flying laboratories functioning, to fulfill his dream of a lifetime. By the third leg of their triangular course, the planes head back for Little America. Byrd's plane takes the widest swing fuel permits as the lenses of the Trimets continue recording new territory. This is the last big flight. Byrd is determined to record the maximum possible. Out over the ice, Byrd is in trouble. His starboard engine is cutting out, now stops. His one remaining engine is losing power. The plane is losing altitude.
R4D1 to base, R4D1 to base. Position Q5, engine out, losing altitude.
The base prepares for rescue operations.
I find a few things strange in this documentary, but this part's kind of weird how there's no sense of urgency in Byrd's voice or in the video of the rescue party. He's their most important guy. Why wouldn't they hurry?
Handicapped by the partial power of one engine, the plane is in jeopardy. Down she drops. The needle drops from 3,000 feet downward, threatening peaks around her. A further drop might mean a crash. Only one hope: reduce the load, lighten her at once. Maybe that way, maybe if enough weight goes, maybe she'll hold. Already the mountains are above. She is deep in the valley, deep in the shadow of disaster. The needle drops downward from 1,700 feet.
Jettison all gear.
This just looks so fake. Like a movie or something, I don't know.
Only the precious films and records are saved. The gamble is life or death. Slowly she starts to climb. She is gaining altitude.
Recognize the hand symbol?
Safe, safe, good going. The greatest exploration flight of all history has ended in success.
I encourage you to watch this documentary. It plays out like a movie.
At the base, the Admiral supervises Operation Secure. All essential records and scientific instruments are to be taken home. He can now report to Admiral Nimitz, Operation Highjump completed. Our men have achieved accomplishments unparalleled in the history of discovery. Our central group has flown far beyond the South Pole, mapped 1/3 million square miles never before seen by man.
Our eastern group mapped 3,000 miles of coast and charted 40,000 square miles of coastal ocean areas hitherto unknown.
Our western group, flying hundreds of air hours, mapped the 4,000-mile Sunset Coast, made the amazing discovery of warm land in Antarctica.
Byrd would go on to talk about this warm land he found in a further interview.
Admiral Byrd, you've been to both the North Pole and the South Pole. Is there any unexplored land left on this Earth that might appeal to adventurous young Americans?
Yes, there is. And not up around the North Pole, because it's getting crowded up there now, because they find out it's really usable, not only to live in, but militarily. But strangely enough, there's left in the world today an area as big as the United States that's never been seen by a human being.
It's strange he would say it's never been seen by a human being when he claims to have seen it.
It's a little risky, but nothing like it used to be with the old slow planes and the small cruising radius where we had to put down bases.
Admiral, an expedition to which I believe you're the advisor is now en route. What is that expedition doing?
Well, that's the icebreaker Atka, and it's a reconnaissance expedition. It's going down to the South Pole area to make certain observations and to look for some bases. They will be back in April, and they will report back, and upon the information we get from that undertaking, we will base the bigger expedition that's to follow. That is being planned right now. So I'm willing to say to you that there will be a number of expeditions that will follow, I think, year after year, at the bottom of the world, because the government has really become interested. Because it happens to be an untouched reservoir of natural resources. The bottom of the world will be important, not only to us, but to our allies.
I was going to ask you, does it have military importance?
It has some, and as the world shrinks, it will continue to shrink with an ever-increasing acceleration, thus bringing these places closer. And in the future, I can see a time when it will be very, very important strategically.
Well, has the development of air power increased the strategic importance of places like the
very much
Palmer
so.
Peninsula, we'll say?
Very much so. Even now, if anything happened and we lost the Panama Canal, we would have to control the islands just north of Antarctica, which are part of Antarctica, then between there and Cape Horn.
I've heard it said that there are 7 continents in the world, and one of them has never been seen by a woman, and that's Antarctica. Is that actually true?
Well, if the Palmer Peninsula is an island, as far as I know, that's true. No woman's ever stepped foot upon the Antarctic continent, and it's the most peaceful place in the world. We've found enough of coal within 180 miles of the South Pole, in a great ridge of mountains. It's not covered with snow, enough to supply the whole world for quite a while.
Well,
that's the coal. Now, there's evidence of many other minerals. We are pretty sure there's oil. Now, that coal shows the bottom of the world. Now, by far the coldest spot in the world. Where that coal is gets 100 below zero in the winter.
Well,
it was once tropical. So we think there's oil there, and there's evidence, probably uranium there.
is it any secret, is there uranium there? That would be the only thing that would be practical to actually go after, I suppose. Everything else would be economically unfeasible, wouldn't it?
Well, as we recklessly expend our resources, the time will come when we'll have to go after that stuff down there. Well, you know, I avoided what you said about uranium. I'm not sure about that. I don't want to have the world fight over the Antarctic.
And Robert, is there a competition among other nations to try to get information about Antarctica and possibly to secure some of these resources?
Well, yes. Russia is interested tremendously. That I'm sure of. Australia has an expedition down there. The Argentine, the Chile, New Zealand, Britain, and so on. Now, you can understand those people down there being interested because they live down there, the New Zealanders, the Argentinians, the Chileans, and Australians. And so we don't do much about claiming anything.
Admiral, you make this sound a little crowded. Are there that many expeditions now there or en route there?
Well, you know, as I said, it's the most peaceful place in the world, but I don't think it will be for long because of this intense interest on the part of other nations and this nation.
Well, Admiral Byrd, are private expeditions a thing of the past? Is expedition and exploration, making expedition and exploration now purely a government function because of the tremendous cost and organization?
No, I don't think so. I think down south it may be more or less a thing of the past.
Let that sink in for a minute. Whatever he found was much more than just ice. They would no longer allow private individuals to travel south.
But not other expeditions that go there. A lot of them go north now.
This latest expedition now on the way is a government expedition, I take it.
Yes, that's the government.
However, may I ask you, is there a great difference between the top of the world and the bottom of the world?
There is. Now, the North Pole is the center of an ocean 10,000 feet deep. The South Pole, the center of a plateau, 10,000 feet high.
If this is true, it proves that the outside of the ring is much higher than the inside.
The North Polar Sea is surrounded by continents slightly frozen. The Antarctic continent is surrounded by a belt of ice, frozen seas of at least 1,200 miles thick. Now, the south is a plateau. It gets, in some places, 14,000 feet up. I've been over areas about 13,000.
This would set up the giant operation Deep Freeze. I will be talking about Deep Freeze in later videos. Thanks for watching, you guys, and have a wonderful day.